The Wire, 10th of September 2023, the reasons China and Russia have gained the most from India's G20 presidency. Ironically, the two leaders who are conspicuously absent from the G20 summit, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, benefit from the summit's most significant accomplishments, which include the addition of the African Union and the consensus statement. India presided over the meeting. Given that both are hailed as Indian achievements, it is essential to consider India's place in the Sino-US rivalry that shapes world politics. Only the most obstinate people still deny that more than a year after Russia invaded Ukraine, the globe is split between those who support China and those who support the United States. Unfortunately, the US-USSR Cold War is the only bipolar conflict most people are familiar with. The nature of the current rivalry is little understood, particularly about the role played by post-colonial nations, sometimes known as the Global South or the former Third World. The interlinkage is the primary distinction. The US-USSR rivalry was essentially a military one, with the Warsaw Pact nations and NATO dividing the globe into spheres of influence. Due to their support of opposing economic systems, there was very little financial interaction between the two opposing groups. The wealthiest American businesses in the competition, like Apple and Tesla, either source their goods from China or fight for a piece of the Chinese market. What can be done when the US and its allies, Europe, Australia, Canada, Japan, and others, increasingly perceive China as a systemic rival? Establishing or strengthening military alliances, such as NATO, the Quad, or AUKUS, has been the first phase. Denying China and its allies access to specific global products in which the US and its partners hold a strong position has been the second phase. The US-initiated restriction on semiconductors has activated this. The denial of 5G services by state-aligned Chinese businesses like Huawei, and the prohibition on Chinese companies purchasing critical infrastructure in the US or other affiliated nations. The second strategy poses a significantly greater risk to China's long-term goals. China's per capita GDP in 2022 was slightly less than $13,000, almost the same as the global average. The GDPs of the United States and the European Union were respectively over $75,000 and just under $40,000. China has to close the gap to fulfill its ambition of becoming an immense power. The central tenet of the CCP's pledge to the Chinese people is that the party alone can elevate them to the level of the Middle Kingdom, situated between the earth and the sky. However, China is unable to challenge these prohibitions in many ways directly. The sanctions imposed on the US and its allies, among other nations, on Russia, Iran, and Cuba show that they control a significant portion of the world economy. Thus, the struggle shifts to the Global South or the non-aligned nations. This seems familiar in a way. With support from the US and USSR, opposing combatant parties in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and South and Southeast Asia, the cold conflict was primarily fought as a hot conflict in developing nations. But the similarities stop there as well. There are a few heated battles where the US and China are on opposing sides, notwithstanding Russia's conflict with Ukraine and the potential for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Furthermore, there are very few opportunities today to pursue policies that benefit their people by playing one superpower off another, unlike the Cold War, when this opposing space allowed relatively unaligned nations like Egypt, the former Yugoslavia, India, and China, which claims much of the glory of the first meeting of non-aligned parties, the Bandung Conference, as its own. This is why the G20 consensus statement is noteworthy and why China and Russia stand to gain the most from the African Union's inclusion. The consensus statement obscures the existence of Russian aggression with its flimsy wording. Russia can claim the consensus statement as its own since it has long maintained that NATO is the one waging war against Russian territoriality and sovereignty. It makes sense that the conclusion infuriated the Ukrainians and delighted the Russian delegation. Alongside Russia's normalization, the African Union joined the G20 as a partner, significantly expanding the number of nations that can formally influence economic systems. Less than a month after BRICS expanded to include Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Argentina, the UAE, and Ethiopia, the US and its allies faced a severe defeat in their attempts to keep China and its partners out of international systems. In keeping China and its allies out of important sectors of the world economy, China saw its first success with India's G20 chairmanship. Of course, the question is why the United States and its allies consented. A portion of the idea is that India will be able to challenge China as the voice of the Global South if it assists in achieving a reasonable G20 conclusion, particularly with the presence of a critical Global South entity like the African Union. It's the economy, stupid, as former U.S. President Bill Clinton once said. China's goal of open global commerce is more appealing to the Global South than a policy restricting trade with China, as the region's median per capita GDP is significantly lower than that of the US and its main allies. With a GDP per person of less than $2,500, India undoubtedly falls into that category. India developed an international strategy during the Cold War centered on decolonization, open trade between blocs, even though its economy was mainly under state control, and applying international law and institutions. It avoided the US-USSR competition somewhat and established itself as a significant voice in the Global South. It has become nearly identical to China in its pursuit of economic growth, adopting a limited strategy of strategic self-interest. It has not criticized Taiwan, Hong Kong, or Xinjiang events and has even helped normalize trade with Russia. India may take credit for the G20's success, but China and Russia have emerged victorious and strengthened their positions in the Global South.